Father Dubé starts his book Happy Are You Poor by explaining that this book is for everyone, and even particularly for the laity, for any Catholic who wants to serve Christ with the whole heart. And that might sound like a crazy idea because it doesn't seem obvious that we're all called to voluntary poverty. And for one thing, that's because oftentimes voluntary poverty is seen as being the same thing as destitution, as lacking the basic food and housing and education that is needed for a decent human life. And I'll let the secret out now, which Father Dubé will be covering in a few chapters, that voluntary poverty is not the same thing as destitution. It's certainly very radical and challenging, but for most of us, it's not the same thing as a lack of basic necessities. And it might seem odd to say that we're all called to voluntary poverty for another reason, which is that a vow of poverty is associated with the religious life. And too often, I think Catholics can tend to see the spiritual life as sort of a two-track program. There's a track for the laity, who are just called to be basically decent human beings. And then there's the track for priests and religious who are called to be saints. But as Vatican II emphasized, we're all called to be saints. We're all called to follow Christ fully. And part of that following, as we read in the gospel, is a call to factual poverty of life. And another reason for confusion is that this teaching is just not being taught in the American Catholic Church. Quite often, in fact, you'll hear people say that poverty isn't necessary, that God doesn't care for wealthy, that wealthy people can easily be saints, can easily follow Christ, that the poverty stuff in the gospel was not supposed to be taken literally. In fact, one of the few sermons I remember hearing on the topic of voluntary poverty, a visiting priest came in and said that he wanted to give a sermon on money. And he said that before we got nervous, he wasn't saying that he wanted our money. He was here to tell us that we had too much money. And he said that this was a dangerous topic to preach on, an unusual topic to preach on, and that the only reason he could preach on it was that he would be gone in the morning since he was just visiting and wouldn't have to hear all the criticism that would come. But even if it's not being widely preached and proclaimed, the fact remains that the gospel has a strong and clear message commanding us to embrace voluntary poverty. You can think of passages such as Matthew 19 with the story of the rich young man, or the story of the rich fool and his barns in Luke 12, the admonition about wealth in Matthew 6, and the discussion of the impossibility of serving two masters in Luke 16. And similarly, the Epistle of James condemns the rich and affluent. In the next chapter, Father Dubé will cover some of the most basic questions people might have about this concept of voluntary poverty.